The air in the Missouri River Valley during the winter of 1830 did not merely grow cold. It became a predatory force, a crystalline weight that settled over the Mandan villages of Mitutanka and Mihtuttahankush like a shroud of white glass. To the modern mind, winter is a season to be managed through thermostats and insulation, but to the Mandan, the great white silence was a sentient adversary. Historical records from this era, preserved in the harrowing journals of fur traders like James Kipp and later echoed in the paintings of George Catlin, reveal a climate so volatile that the mercury in a thermometer, had the Mandan possessed one, would have retreated into its bulb and frozen solid. When the plains turned to this brittle, translucent state, the horizon vanished. The sky and the earth merged into a singular blinding void of sub-zero wind, known to the elders as the breath of the north wind. To understand this moment of supreme vulnerability, we must first look at the forgotten customs of Mandan structural engineering. Unlike the nomadic Sioux or Cheyenne, who followed the seasonal migrations of the buffalo with portable teepees, the Mandan were the architects of the plains. They were sedentary, a people of the soil, bound to the riverbanks by their vast gardens of corn, beans, and squash. This permanence was their greatest strength and their most terrifying liability. As the first blizzard of the season descended, a black blizzard that carried topsoil and ice shards in a 60-mile-per-hour gale, a Mandan warrior standing on the roof of his earth lodge faced a crucial threshold. If the cache pits were not sealed, if the timbered palisades were breached by the shifting weight of the drifts, or if the sacred fires flickered out, the lineage of 1,000 years could be extinguished in a single night of frost. The harsh reality of the 1830s meant that survival was a mathematical equation of calories against cold. The Missouri River, the lifeblood of their civilization, transformed into a jagged highway of ice, often several feet thick. The sound of the river freezing was not silent. It was a rhythmic, booming artillery strike as the expanding ice buckled and cracked under its own immense pressure. This sound signaled the closing of the world. The Mandan were now locked in. Their world shrank from the vast, rolling prairies to the interior diameter of an earth lodge, roughly 40 to 60 feet of subterranean sanctuary. In this threshold, the psychological pressure was as heavy as the earth piled atop their homes. The Mandan knew that beyond the village walls, the buffalo had sought the deep coulees for shelter, and the elk had vanished into the timber. Any human caught in the open for more than 20 minutes would experience the white death, a state where the lungs crystallize and the heart slows to a rhythmic crawl before stopping entirely. We must examine the technical brilliance of the Mandan Earth Lodge to appreciate the stakes. These were not mere huts. They were complex, multi-layered domes. A frame of massive cottonwood trunks supported a lattice of willow branches, which was then covered in a thick layer of prairie grass and finally encased in over a foot of packed, insulating river clay. When the exterior temperature plummeted to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the interior of the lodge, heated by a single central fire and the communal warmth of 30 people and their prized buffalo horses, remained a staggering 50 to 60 degrees warmer than the outside air. Yet this sanctuary was a fragile bubble. The threshold between life and a frozen grave was the thickness of that clay wall. In this phase of the winter, the Mandan entered a state of vigilant hibernation. Every breath was calculated, every piece of dried buffalo meat was rationed with the precision of a modern surgeon. The fear was not merely of the cold, but of what the cold represented, the judgment of the Great Spirit, Ma-ho-po-pa-ri-ush. To the Mandan, the winter was a period of spiritual reckoning. If the village had been disharmonious during the harvest, the winter would be long and the game scarce. As we stand at this threshold, looking out through the smoke hole of a lodge into a sky filled with sun dogs, ice crystals refracting light into ghostly halos, we see a people who did not just survive the cold, they mastered its psychology. They understood that the mind freezes long before the body does. The isolation of the northern plains in midwinter was a sensory deprivation chamber. No birds sang, no water flowed. The only sound was the howling of the wind through the drying racks and the occasional mournful lowing of a horse kept in the lodge's interior stable. The Mandan's ancient secret was not just physical. It was the realization that in the face of an infinite winter, the community must become a single organism. The threshold of 1830 was particularly brutal, preceding the smallpox devastation that would later nearly wipe them out. In this moment, they were at the height of their resilience. They were the masters of the Missouri, the gatekeepers of the northern trade routes, and the only humans capable of thriving where the earth itself turned to glass. They stood at the edge of the abyss, wrapped in buffalo robes, with the fur turned inward, a technical detail that trapped a layer of stagnant air against the skin, creating an early form of thermal insulation. As the sun dipped below the frozen horizon, casting long, bruised shadows of purple and blue across the drifts, the Mandan prepared for the long night. This was the beginning of the end of the year, a time when the physical world died, so that the spiritual world could speak. The transition was violent, beautiful, and absolute. The Mandan did not fear the white glass. They respected it as the ultimate teacher of what it meant to be human. To endure was to prove their worth to the ancestors who had carved a civilization out of the hardest land on the continent. Before we dive deeper into the archives of the past, subscribe to Wildbound History and tell us in the comments what country and city are you watching from. To step inside a Mandan earth lodge during the peak of a 19th century winter is to enter a living museum of human ingenuity, a sanctuary where the history of the everyday was written in smoke, leather, and stored sunlight. While the world outside was a crystalline wasteland of white glass, the interior of the lodge was a humid, golden-hued archive of survival. Historical records from the 1830s, particularly the ethnographic sketches of Prince Maximilian of Wied, described these structures not as primitive huts, but as sophisticated hubs of communal life. The air inside was thick, a heavy, aromatic tapestry of burning willow, drying sweetgrass, the musky scent of buffalo robes, and the earthy dampness of the clay walls. This was the archive of life, a space where every tool, every garment, and every ritual was a direct response to the uncompromising reality of the northern plains. The architecture itself was the first line of defense. A central fire pit, roughly 4 to 5 feet in diameter, served as the beating heart of the lodge. Above it, a circular opening in the roof, the smoke hole, acted as the only source of natural light and the primary ventilation system. But in the depths of winter, this hole was a vulnerability. To manage the heat, the Mandan used a smoke hole cover, made of translucent rawhide stretched over a wooden frame, which allowed a ghostly, diffused light to filter in, while preventing the precious warmth from escaping into the sub-zero sky. To understand the Mandan's success, we must look at the forgotten customs of their spatial organization. The lodge was divided with the precision of a naval vessel. The area closest to the fire was the social and ceremonial center, while the outer perimeter, shielded by the thickest part of the earth walls, served as the sleeping quarters and storage zones. The archive of life was literally beneath their feet. The Mandan were masters of the cache pit, bell-shaped excavations dug deep into the floor of the lodge or just outside its entrance. These pits were lined with dried grass and willow bark to prevent moisture from seeping in, creating a subterranean pantry that could hold dozens of bushels of dried corn, beans, and squash. This was the result of a massive agricultural effort that took place under the scorching summer sun of the previous July. The Mandan ancient secret was their ability to store the energy of the sun in the form of dried maize, which provided the high carbohydrate fuel necessary for the human body to generate heat in a climate that sought to extinguish it. Each kernel of corn was a tiny battery of life, a testament to the labor of the Mandan women, who were the primary architects of the food supply. But the archive contained more than just food. It held the tools of a history of the everyday that modern society has long forgotten. There were the scrapers made from the shoulder blades of elk, used to soften the heavy buffalo hides that served as both clothing and bedding. A single buffalo robe was a marvel of biological engineering. The hollow hairs of the winter coat trapped air, providing a level of insulation that modern synthetic materials struggle to replicate. The Mandan wore these with the fur side in, against the skin, creating a micro-environment of body heat. In the corners of the lodge, one would find the dog travois and the bull boat, the latter a circular vessel made of a single buffalo hide stretched over a willow frame. During the winter, these boats were hauled inside, dried and repaired, leaning against the massive cottonwood pillars that supported the roof. The sensory immersion of this archive was profound. The sound of the lodge was a low hum, the rhythmic scraping of hide-working tools, the soft murmur of elders reciting the history of the world to the younger generation, and the occasional stamp of a horse's hoof. It was a common Mandan custom to bring their most prized war ponies inside the lodge during the most brutal stretches of the winter. These horses were kept in a partitioned area near the entrance, separated from the living quarters by a screen of woven willow. This was not merely for the animal's protection. The massive body heat of a 1,000-pound horse contributed significantly to the ambient temperature of the lodge. The horse was a member of the family, its breath visible in the dim light, adding its own life force to the communal struggle against the frost. The tools of the Mandan were extensions of the land itself. Consider the bone needle and the sinew thread. In the 1830s, a tear in a winter garment was a life-threatening emergency. The Mandan women spent their winter days in the archive of life, meticulously repairing the seams of moccasins and leggings. They used the sinew from the back of the buffalo, a material that shrinks when wet, creating a waterproof, airtight seal. This technical detail was the difference between a hunter returning with a frostbitten foot or a successful kill. The archive of life was a place of constant maintenance. Nothing was disposable. Every scrap of leather, every splinter of bone, and every dried stalk of corn had a purpose in the grand strategy of defiance against the white glass of the plains. As we analyze the psychological landscape of this phase, we see the Mandan as a people of profound patience. The harsh reality of the 1880s, the era of the reservation system that would eventually dismantle this way of life, was still decades away. But the Mandan already lived with the knowledge that their survival was a delicate balance. The archive of life was their library of resilience. It was here that they practiced the wisdom of the silence. In a world where movement outside was often impossible, the Mandan turned inward, cultivating a rich oral tradition that preserved their history back to the mythical Great Flood. This wasn't just storytelling, it was a psychological anchor that prevented the isolation from devolving into despair. They were not stuck in the lodge. They were the guardians of a sacred flame, waiting for the earth to wake from its frozen sleep. The contrast between the interior and the exterior was the defining tension of their existence. Outside, the wind howled with a frequency that could drive a man to madness, stripping the bark from the cottonwood trees and burying the palisades in 20-foot drifts. Inside, the Mandan lived in a world of texture and warmth. They touched the rough bark of the support pillars, the smooth, oily surface of the dried meat, and the soft, downy fur of the winter robes. This was the history of the everyday, a quiet, relentless labor of love and survival that proved that even in the heart of a frozen void, the human spirit could create a home that was both a fortress and a temple. To stand within the palisades of a Mandan village in the dead of January was to understand the true meaning of a geographic prison. Beyond the timbered walls, the Great Plains had ceased to be a landscape of opportunity and had become a sensory deprivation chamber of white glass and screaming wind. Historical records from the 1830s, most notably the somber reflections of the painter George Catlin, depict a world where the horizon simply ceased to exist. This was not merely physical confinement, it was a profound psychological isolation that tested the very fabric of the Mandan soul. In this era, being alone did not mean a lack of company. The lodges were crowded with 30 or 40 souls, but rather a total severance from the rest of the living world. To the north, south, east and west, there was nothing but 1,000 miles of frozen silence, a reality that exerted a crushing pressure on the human psyche. The harsh reality of the 1830s meant that for 4 months of the year, the Mandan were effectively an island in an ocean of ice. This isolation created a unique psychological state, characterized by vigilant stillness. In the modern world, we equate silence with peace, but for the Mandan pioneers and ancestors, silence was a warning. It meant the game had fled. It meant the scouts could not hear the approach of rival raiding parties over the muffled snow. It meant that the only thing moving was the frost. The psychological impact of this isolation on the pioneers of the Missouri cannot be overstated. When the human eye is denied color, seeing only the browns of the lodge interior and the blinding white of the exterior, the mind begins to turn inward with a ferocity that can lead to cabin fever, or, in the Mandan tongue, a fracturing of the spirit. To understand this moment, we must look at the forgotten customs of Mandan storytelling as a psychological survival mechanism. The isolation was fought with the weapon of the word. Within the earth lodges, the elders became the architects of a mental landscape that was far more vibrant than the frozen one outside. They spoke of the lone man and the first creator, weaving narratives that lasted for days. These were not mere entertainments, they were cognitive anchors. By reciting their lineage and their myths, they reaffirmed their place in a universe that seemed intent on erasing them. The history of the everyday in this phase was a battle against the white void. If a man lost his connection to the community's story, he was lost to the winter. This was a psychological warfare where the enemy was the crushing weight of the great white silence. The technical reality of this isolation was reinforced by the geography of the northern plains. The Mandan villages were situated on high bluffs overlooking the Missouri, exposed to the full, unmitigated fury of the Arctic fronts that swept down from the Canadian shield. There were no forests to break the wind, only the skeletal remains of cottonwood groves in the bottomlands. This meant that any venture outside for wood or water was a high-stakes gamble with mortality. The isolation was so absolute that if a lodge collapsed under the weight of a drift, or if a fire went out in the middle of a blizzard, the neighboring lodge, only 30 feet away, might not know for days. The snow acted as a perfect acoustic insulator, swallowing screams and muffling the sounds of catastrophe. This created a paradox. They lived in a dense community, yet each lodge was a sovereign, isolated planet orbiting a central fire. Furthermore, we must analyze the impact of visual hunger. For months, the Mandan saw no green, no flowing water, and no movement other than the drifting snow. This led to a heightened focus on the internal aesthetics of their world. They decorated their robes with intricate porcupine quillwork, dyed in vibrant reds and yellows using berries and minerals gathered in the autumn. These bursts of color were psychological necessities, small, defiant protests against the monochromatic tyranny of the winter. The ancient secret of the Mandan was their understanding that the human eye requires complexity to remain sane. Their ceremonies, even those held in the cramped confines of a winter lodge, were sensory explosions of drumming, chanting, and rhythmic movement designed to shatter the oppressive stillness of the plains. The isolation also bred a specific type of social tension. In a space 40 feet wide, 30 people lived, ate, slept, and dreamt together for 120 days. The wisdom of the silence became a social lubricant. The Mandan developed a sophisticated code of non-verbal communication and personal space. They learned the art of the unspoken, where a look or a gesture carried the weight of a sentence. Conflict was a luxury they could not afford. A divided lodge was a dead lodge. The psychological resilience required to maintain harmony in such proximity while the world outside literally froze to death is a testament to the sophistication of their social structures. They were masters of communal psychology long before the term existed in the Western lexicon. As the weeks turned into months, the isolation deepened into a spiritual ordeal. The Mandan viewed the winter as a time when the veil between the physical and spirit worlds was at its thinnest. The howling wind was interpreted as the voices of the ancestors or the hungry ghosts of the prairie. This added a layer of supernatural dread to the physical isolation. Every creak of the lodge's massive timber frame was a conversation. Every shadow cast by the flickering central fire was a potential visitor from the other side. This was the true, crucial threshold. Not just the survival of the body, but the preservation of the mind against the encroaching darkness. To survive the isolation of the Missouri was to emerge in the spring not just as a survivor, but as a person who had looked into the void and refused to blink. The Mandan's psychological isolation was a crucible. It stripped away the superficialities of life, leaving only the core pillars of human existence: heat, hunger, and heritage. It was in this frozen theater of the mind that the Mandan forged their greatest legacy, a culture of such immense internal strength that it could withstand the white glass of the plains and the lonely pressure of the infinite horizon. They were the masters of the still point in a turning, freezing world. The true breaking point of the Great Plains winter does not arrive with the first frost. It arrives in the agonizing stretch of late February, when the white glass has become a permanent, suffocating reality. In the winter of 1830, historical records suggest a convergence of atmospheric cruelty, a polar vortex of such sustained intensity that the very timber of the Mandan earth lodges began to moan under the contraction of extreme cold. This was the moment of maximum entropy. The cache pits, once overflowing with the golden wealth of the summer harvest, were reaching their silty bottoms. The dried buffalo meat, once stacked like cordwood, had dwindled to blackened strips. This was the raw, unvarnished climax of the Mandan struggle, a physical and spiritual siege where the line between life and a frozen eternity was thinner than a single strand of sinew. To understand this moment of supreme gravity, we must look at the technical failure of the environment. The Missouri River was no longer a frozen highway, it was a tomb. The ancient secret of the Mandan, their reliance on stored agricultural surplus, was being pushed to its mathematical limit. When the internal temperature of the lodge began to lose its battle against the 50-degree external gale, the Mandan faced the breaking point of the biological machine. The human body, deprived of sufficient fat and protein, begins to auto-cannibalize, drawing heat from its own muscle tissue. The elders, ever the guardians of the collective soul, watched the flickering central fire with a gaze that saw beyond the smoke hole. They knew that if the wood ran out, or if the last horse succumbed to the cold, the village of Mitutanka would become a silent monument of clay and bone. The climax reached its fever pitch during a legendary 10-day whiteout, a storm so dense that a man could not see his own hand held before his face. In this sensory vacuum, a Mandan hunter named Four Bears, a man whose resilience would later be immortalized by Western artists, faced the ultimate act of sacrifice. The village's perimeter was being encroached upon by a pack of starving great grey wolves, driven to madness by the same famine. This was the history of the everyday, turned into a cinematic nightmare. The wolves were not mere animals. They were the physical manifestation of the winter's hunger. The breaking point arrived when the central fire of the Great Medicine Lodge began to fail. Without the sacred fire, the spiritual protection of the tribe was considered breached. The act of bravery that followed was narrated with the gravity of an era-defining event. Four bears and a small contingent of warriors had to venture into the white void to retrieve the heartwood, the dense, oil-rich cedar buried in the snow-choked ravines nearly a mile from the Palisades. To leave the lodge was a suicide mission. The air was a physical solid. To breathe too deeply was to invite a pulmonary edema as the freezing moisture scorched the lung tissue. This was the breaking point, where the physical isolation of Phase 3 transformed into a violent confrontation with nature. They moved not as men, but as ghosts, wrapped in stiffened buffalo hides, guided only by the rhythmic thrum of the wind against the river bluffs. Inside the lodges, the silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic chanting of the women, a low, guttural vibration intended to tether the spirits of the hunters to the warmth of the hearth. This was the psychological isolation pushed to its breaking point. Every second the door flap remained open, the precious internal microclimate vanished, replaced by a swirl of killing frost. The technical reality of the 1830s winter meant that if the hunters failed, the social contract of the Mandan would dissolve. But the Mandan were not a people of retreat. The climax was reached when, through the blinding curtain of white glass, the hunters returned, dragging the heavy cedar logs behind them. Their faces were blackened by frostbite, their eyelashes fused with ice, but the wood was secured. The fire was rebuilt. The heartwood caught, sending a plume of sparks toward the smoke hole, a defiant signal of red and orange against the oppressive white sky. This was the act of final bravery, the refusal to be extinguished. It was a victory of the human will over the thermal laws of the universe. Yet the cost was visible. The breaking point left its mark on every face in the lodge. This was the crucial threshold of their existence, a moment where they realized that they did not own the land. They were merely permitted to exist upon it by the grace of their own resilience. The gravity of this event is echoed in the oral histories that survived into the 20th century. The winter the fire almost died was the winter the Mandan truly understood their own immortality. This was not a romanticized victory. It was a grim, mechanical survival. The ancient secret was revealed to be nothing more and nothing less than the refusal to stop moving. As the hunters thawed their limbs by the rejuvenated flame, the archive of life was replenished, not with food, but with a new story of sacrifice. The Mandan had looked into the eye of the white wolf and found that their own hearts beat with a fiercer rhythm. The climax of the winter of 1830 was a defining moment for the northern plains, a testament to a civilization that treated the most hostile environment on Earth as a sacred home. When the white glass finally begins to spiderweb and crack, it does not happen with a roar, but with a series of wet, heavy thuds, the sound of 3 feet of packed snow sliding off the earthen domes of the Mandan village. This is the historical aftermath, the somber period of reckoning that follows a season of total war against the elements. As the Missouri River groans, its ice plates buckling and grinding together like the tectonic plates of a dying world, the Mandan emerge from their subterranean sanctuaries. They are not the same people who entered the lodges in November. Historical records from the mid-19th century, particularly the analytical observations of the American Fur Company traders, describe the survivors of these deep frost winters as gaunt, their skin the color of weathered parchment, yet possessed of an unnerving quiet intensity. The aftermath is a moment of profound atmospheric and physical transition. To understand this moment, we must look at the forgotten customs of the first thaw. The Mandan did not celebrate immediately. They assessed the damage with the clinical precision of survivors. They walked the perimeter of the village, checking the integrity of the cottonwood palisades that had been stressed by the shifting weight of the drifts. They tallied the loss of livestock, the horses that didn't make it, their frozen carcasses now being reclaimed by the mud. The history of the everyday and the aftermath was a grueling process of sanitation and reconstruction. The interior of the lodges after 4 months of communal living were thick with the soot of the heartwood fires and the biological waste of 30 souls. The first act of the aftermath was the Great Airing, where the smoke hole covers were cast aside and the damp, freezing spring air was allowed to scour the interior. But the true aftermath was psychological and demographic. A winter like that of 1830 acted as a biological filter. The very old and the very young were often missing from the communal circles around the spring fires. The Mandan accepted this with a stoicism that modern society finds difficult to comprehend. To them, the white glass was a judge, Those who perished were not lost in the modern sense, but had merely transitioned into the spiritual geography of the plains. However, the technical reality of the 1830s meant that the Mandan were becoming increasingly vulnerable. Every brutal winter that thinned their numbers made the looming threat of nomadic expansion and European disease more potent. The aftermath was a period of fragile recovery, where the tribe had to quickly transition from the vigilant hibernation of winter to the back-breaking labor of the spring planting. Historical analysis reveals that the Mandans' ancient secret, their sedentary agricultural lifestyle, was both their savior and their eventual undoing. In the aftermath of the Great Freeze, the women returned to the river bottomlands. Using hoes fashioned from the shoulder blades of buffalo, they cleared the debris left by the retreating ice to plant the three sisters: corn, beans, and squash. This was a race against time. The soil was still cold, a reminder of the great white silence that had only just retreated. The aftermath was not a time of rest, but of frantic energy. The Mandan had to replenish their archive of life before the next cycle began. This relentless cycle of extreme survival created a culture of immense mechanical and spiritual efficiency, but it also left them no margin for error. As we look at the broader tapestry of history, the aftermath of these winters settled into the very architecture of the Mandan soul. They became a people who lived with the constant awareness of the breaking point. Nay, the 1830s were the twilight years of their undisputed dominance over the upper Missouri. While they had defeated the cold, the aftermath brought new, invisible invaders. The trade routes that opened with the melting of the river ice brought not just blankets and steel, but the pathogens that would eventually do what the white wolf of winter could not. To analyze the Mandan aftermath is to witness a civilization at its peak of resilience, unaware that the environmental hardships they had mastered were merely the prelude to a different kind of winter, a winter of colonization and change. The physical landscape of the aftermath was a scarred one. The plains, once a pristine sheet of glass, were now a chaotic expanse of mud, dead grass, and the skeletal remains of the trees that had been stripped of their bark by starving elk. This was the raw reality of the frontier. There was no romantic beauty in the thaw. There was only the smell of wet earth and the realization that another year of life had been earned. The Mandan stood on the bluffs, watching the ice floes carry the remnants of the winter toward the south. They had endured the isolation. They had survived the psychological pressure. They had held the fire through the climax. The aftermath was their period of grave reflection, a time to honor the sacrifice of the hunters and the wisdom of the elders who had kept the heartwood burning. In the grand narrative of the American West, this phase is often overlooked. We focus on the battles and the migrations, but the true history is found in the quiet aftermath of the freeze. It is the story of how a people picked up the pieces of their lives in a world that had tried to erase them. The Mandan's resilience was not a loud, boisterous thing. It was the sound of a bone hoe hitting the softening earth. It was the wisdom of the silence manifesting as action. They were the masters of the aftermath, a people who knew that the only way to truly defy the cold was to plant the seeds of the future in the mud of the past. As the final vestiges of the white glass dissolve into the thirsty soil of the northern plains, we are left to contemplate a legacy that is etched not in stone, but in the very resilience of the human spirit. The story of the Mandan is not merely a chronicle of survival against a hostile climate. It is a profound documentary of the human capacity to find meaning in the midst of a void. When we look back at the winter of 1830, we are not just looking at a footnote in the history of the American West. We are looking at a masterclass in communal preservation. The Mandan did not just inhabit the plains, they coexisted with a landscape that demanded total devotion and absolute clarity. Their ancient secret was never a hidden formula or a magical rite. It was the sophisticated integration of architecture, agriculture, and an unshakable oral tradition that transformed a frozen prison into a sacred home. To understand this legacy, we must look at the forgotten customs of the Mandan as a blueprint for modern resilience. In an age where we are increasingly disconnected from the rhythms of the natural world, the Mandan remind us of the wisdom of the silence. They proved that isolation does not have to result in the fracturing of the soul, provided one is anchored by a shared story and a common purpose. The historical records of the late 19th century tell a tragic tale of the smallpox epidemic of 1837, which would eventually decimate the Mandan population only years after the brutal winters we have explored. Yet, even as their numbers dwindled, their cultural DNA, their songs, their lodge-building techniques, and their agricultural prowess flowed into the neighboring tribes, creating a lasting legacy of endurance that persists in the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara nation today. The harsh reality of the 1830s meant that every decision was a matter of life and death, yet the Mandan approached this gravity with a sense of honor and sacrifice. They understood that they were part of a great tapestry, a lineage that stretched back to the beginning of time and forward into an uncertain future. When we analyze the Mandan through the lens of a lead documentarian, we see a people who were the ultimate pragmatists and the ultimate dreamers. They built fortresses of earth to defy the wind, but they filled those fortresses with the vibrant colors of quillwork and the thunderous rhythm of the drum. This duality, the ability to face the white wolf of winter with both a spear and a song, is the true hallmark of their civilization. The psychological isolation they endured offers a timeless reflection on the nature of the human mind. The Mandan taught us that when the exterior world turns to glass, the interior world must become a garden. Their reliance on the history of the everyday, the maintenance of the fire, the repair of the moccasin, the sharing of the corn, shows us that greatness is often found in the smallest acts of persistence. Their legacy is a tribute to the quiet brave, the hunter who ventures into the blizzard not for glory, but for the warmth of his children. It is a tribute to the women who calculated the caloric needs of a village with the precision of an engineer, ensuring that the archive of life never truly went empty. As we stand on the modern bluffs overlooking the Missouri River today, the earth lodges are gone, replaced by the scars of time and the shifting currents of the water. Yet the wind still howls with the same frequency it did in 1830. The great white silence still descends upon the plains. And in that silence, if one listens closely, the echoes of the Mandan resilience can still be heard. They remain a beacon of what it means to be human, in a world that is often indifferent to our survival. They remind us that our greatest strength is not our technology, but our connection to each other and to the earth that sustains us. This documentary journey has taken us through the crucial threshold, into the heart of the archive of life, and through the breaking point of the human soul. What remains is a profound respect for a people who turned the most brutal environment on the continent into a stage for human dignity. The Mandan did not just survive the white glass, they shattered it with the heat of their own will. Their story is a reminder that as long as the fire is tended and the stories are told, the winter can never truly win. Thank you for exploring the untamed past with us at Wildbound History. If you believe these stories of resilience must never be forgotten, hit the like button and subscribe for our next historical journey. Until next time, stay wild.